You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. Filling in for Will Compernell, I'm your host, Mark Streiber, economic analyst at FHN Financial. Artificial intelligence is primed to have an extraordinary impact on human history and the economy. But just exactly when and how it will have an impact is anyone's guess. On today's episode, we talk with Lisa Simon, Chief Economist at Revelio Labs, about where and how she sees AI impacting the labor market for both employers and employees. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with Lisa Simon. But first, a quick market update. After a calmer than usual start to the year, markets were upended last week as President Trump threatened additional tariffs on European nations that oppose the U.S. acquisition of Greenland. The tariffs would take effect on February 1st and would start at 10%. Those tariffs would then rise to as high as 25% by June 1st if the U.S. still has not acquired Greenland, which is an autonomous territory of Denmark. President Trump has claimed repeatedly that the U.S. needs Greenland for military and national security reasons, as the territory lies directly between the U.S. eastern seaboard and Russia. Major U.S. stock indexes tumbled 2% on Tuesday, and have only managed to recover about half of that sell-off since Trump's appearance at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The president then claimed there is a framework deal in place for Greenland. In December, the CPI rose 0.3%, and the core CPIs rose 0.2%, keeping the annual increases unchanged at 2.7% and 2.6% respectively. Several sectors saw faster than normal one-month increases, attributed to catch-up in data collection rather than accelerating price increases. The average monthly change in the CPI in the 3 months since September is 0.2%. The 3-month average core increase is 0.13%. If sustained, those increases are consistent with 2.4% headline and 1.6% core inflation. But the trailing 12-month change is not yet close enough to 2% to warrant any more rate cuts just yet. The November PPI rose 0.2% headline and core, but the year-on-year measures jumped to 3% and 3.5% respectively because of a big upward revision to September and a further big increase in October. While some sectors feeding into the PCE deflator, like airline passenger services, fell in October and November, others saw bigger increases than in the CPI. Portfolio management services, for example, rose 3.8% in October and 1.4% in November. Health and medical insurance, a hot topic at the start of this year, both rose 0.3% in both months. Core PPI inflation at 3.5% in November is 0.6% higher than the September year-on-year rate reported before the shutdown. Retail sales rose 0.6% in November, while sales ex autos and gas and control group sales both rose 0.4% in the month. Those are solid increases considering the government shutdown in the first half of the month. Black Friday and other holiday shopping likely helped perk up sales numbers, offsetting shutdown-related softness. PCE inflation printed as expected in October and November, and while the monthly increases of 0.2% is good news on the inflation front, it is not enough to encourage any more rate cuts just yet. Both personal income and spending were solid in October and November despite the government shutdown, setting up a strong finish for GDP in 2025. The Atlanta Fed's GDP nowcast shows 5.4% annualized growth in the fourth quarter. That's all for the market update this time. Now, our discussion with Lisa Simon.
Our guest today is Lisa Simon, Chief Economist at Revelio Labs. Lisa, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, Will, thanks so much for having me.
Our topic today is how artificial intelligence is impacting the labor market. Now, AI, if it does end up as this generational, transformational technology that a lot of people are hyping it up to be, it's going to have a lot of long-term impacts on the economy and labor market. But Lisa, I want to start by talking about the immediate term. What evidence do we have that AI has replaced any worker so far? Can you look at the monthly jobs report, for instance, and really identify where AI has contributed to the 4.4% unemployment rate or slowdown in jobs growth we saw in 2025?
Yeah, it's incredibly hard to do. The reason is that there are so many other things going on in the economy right now, right? We're living in uncertain times with tariffs, with sort of policy uncertainty, with buffers on labor supply from immigration side, from all sorts of demographic shifts. So AI, don't deny it's part of the story, and there are a lot of things happening at the same time. And it's the reason it's so hard to disentangle all these effects because they're all happening sort of simultaneously, right? Like COVID recovery, downturn. But we've done some analyses at Revelio Labs. I don't think there's any outright workers having been displaced by AI right now. In any case, technology typically doesn't actually displace entire occupations, right? It replaces parts of occupations, which we call tasks or activities that can be performed by artificial intelligence. And then what that typically does is sort of a slow occupational transformation and perhaps a reduction in labor demand as a result of that. But you rarely see really workers displaced fully, even by sort of, the biggest shifts. And those things tend to happen really slowly. What we do find is that the higher the AI exposure of an occupation, and highly AI exposed roles are things like software engineers, database administrator, financial analysts, really roles that are highly white collar and high education, also high salary. Those jobs, especially at the entry level, have seen the biggest slowdown in demand since 2022. So there does seem to be really a correlation, and we measure this with really quite a high level of variability, that the more highly exposed occupations, meaning those that have like higher tasks share that can be achieved by AI, are seeing bigger slowdowns.
I think that's really interesting. And maybe this is more of a speculative question, but if it is the case that entry level jobs are going to be at risk the most, there could be a gap in the workforce down the line. I mean, everyone who has intermediate or expert skills right now started out at some point as entry level. So, what happens if that first step of the career ladder isn't available anymore?
I am hugely worried about just succession planning at companies at large at the moment, with hiring having been so low for such a long time now, and that sort of being overrepresented, that first career rung, as you say, in the entry level roles. I think in a couple of years' times, companies are going to find themselves just lacking workers to promote and to be able to fill that middle manager role that they currently have folks doing. And it's no surprise that sort of middle management is seeing a little bit of a revival or rebirth in terms of just representation in the workforce right now. Because if it's true that AI can perform a lot of these entry level roles, the missing what AI isn't so good at is task coordination, right? Like putting it all back together, coordinating it into explicit output, and then pushing it further up through the value chain to actually produce valuable products. So I am worried about the succession planning at companies at the moment.
Focusing again just on the immediate term, what we can already see so far. Productivity is notoriously difficult for economists to measure in the short run. The quarterly data, for example, that are published, we just take GDP, divide it by the number of worker hours, and as you'd expect, there can be a noisy measure of capturing whether we're actually getting any better at doing the same tasks. Do you have any concrete idea of whether AI at this stage has already made workers materially more productive? I mean, when I look at what AI is capable of doing, it's all very impressive, but I can't tell if they're just cool gimmicks and they haven't really made anyone's job all that more efficient.
It's a really hard question. I have never seen a productivity measure that I actually believe and sort of find convincing. So I think this question of productivity is incredibly hard to answer. There are these plots going around at the moment where if you look at the returns in the stocks of the S&P 500 or whatever, well-performing set of public companies you're looking at, and their headcounts, for the first time really in history, there's a complete decoupling in the financial returns to the headcount. And I don't want to overinterpret this as like, this is sort of the end of workforce productivity providing the returns these companies are receiving. But there is definitely sort of a turning point that we're observing. And, the economy hasn't collapsed, and hiring has just been very subdued for a really long period of time. So it must be true that companies are doing more with less. And I see it in my own work, the amount of things I'm able to get done with the help of, my trusted AI pet. It is really like having sort of an additional research assistant at your disposal. So it's hard to imagine it not having an impact, but I don't know whether we're seeing it in like the aggregate productivity metrics yet.
Yeah, I think something that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said after the last Fed meeting is that there has been a sustained increase in productivity, but it really happened before AI reached this inflection point. And again, going back to how we impute it from other national numbers, it's hard to tell, well, maybe we've just shifted towards sector that are less labor intensive. And again, we think of productivity as this easy concept of doing the same with fewer resources, but it's harder to decipher. Technology has made it easier to match the right people with the right jobs over time. A couple hundred years ago, to take one extreme, advertising jobs to potential workers was difficult, as was finding the ideal job. And now we can use the internet to find workers and jobs across the country, across the world. And this makes for a more productive economy because we're getting the best matching, so to speak. But do you think AI and current technology has made it too easy to post and apply for jobs to the point where it's become too difficult to separate the bots from serious candidates and job openings?
Yeah, there's definitely been a deterioration of that relationship between job postings and actual hires. We do observe that very dramatically in our data, where basically the ratio of job postings to actual hires happening has been decreasing. Again, that decrease, I think, maybe predates 2022. So this secular trend of some erosion around hiring etiquette, I call it, sort of predating AI, but AI certainly doesn't help, right? And it does sometimes feel like, on the one hand, you have all these AI generated job descriptions that are being applied to by AI generated CVs. At the end of the day, hiring is still a very innately human job and set of tasks, and sure, there's sort of a set of tasks that are very, very automatable, but at the end of the day, two people need to pick up the phone and see whether there's sort of a real match. I think there's sort of just a lot of activity driven by AI in the hiring space that doesn't lead to anything, and at the end of the day, someone just needs to talk to someone else in order to get hired.
Yeah, I'm hoping, as you said, there's a so-called AI slop where both the job postings or the job applications have clearly been, a lot of the work has been done by AI. And maybe that just means that companies and workers need to find a slight new signal to say, I'm a human and I'm not a robot. I mean, in my experience, writing a 200-word cover letter to apply for a job is like the most tedious thing of my day. But I have to say that the effort made it so that I was only applying for positions that I was really interested in. And that could be the necessary obstacle instead of, you go on a job posting website and just hit automatically apply for 1,000 positions.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what's happening. And you hear all these stories of people applying to thousands of jobs, and it's like, well, it just can't be true that all these thousands of jobs were good matches for you in the first place, right? And maybe if you had just applied to 5 well-selected jobs, the outcome would have been the same.
New technologies can make certain jobs obsolete in the long run. Of course, there were positions 100 years ago, maybe even decades ago, that are now entirely replaced by machines. But new technology can also make jobs more productive. As I talk with you here, and I have Excel spreadsheets on my computer, there are so many things available to me that make my job more productive rather than replacing me as a worker. Broadly speaking, when we think about AI in this context, is there any easy way to think about what kinds of jobs AI will replace versus the kinds that it will be making more productive? And I guess at the heart of this question is, what do we still think humans are only capable of doing versus machines?
I think it's a really interesting question. And just a sidebar to the first thing you said, there's actually only one job that sort of completely disappeared off of SOC codes over the past like 50 years or so, and that is elevator operator. So I always like to bring up that little anecdote. If we think about like truly jobs disappearing, there's actually not that many. The way I think about it is sort of along three dimensions. One is this idea of AI exposure, right? So, how many tasks within your occupation can AI actually do for you? The second dimension is adoption. Like you as a person in that job, how many tasks do you then use AI for to get that job done, right? And then the third one is sort of a complexity question. And that is like, how many different tasks are there within your job? And is it actually possible or even feasible to sort of displace a meaningful chunk of your work to AI? I think some of the most highly exposed occupations, the adoption rates are also very high. So people are making themselves more productive. And it might mean that in the long run, we might just need fewer people in those jobs, but the job itself isn't getting displaced because the person within the job still needs to like do all the coordination between the tasks. But I think there are other types of work that are perhaps simpler, and we've actually seen this a little bit more in the lower end of the wage distribution. If you're in a job that is highly exposed to AI at the bottom end of the wage distribution and adoption tends to be low at those points, that's typically indicative that there is some real like displacement potential, in the sense that some technology or machine or something will come from the outside displacing that job. And that's why we've seen that highly AI exposed low wage occupation have seen the lowest wage gains over the past 5 years or so among all jobs. Those are really the ones that are being hit the hardest. And there are these types of jobs. So while the most AI exposed roles are definitely very white collar, high education, high salary jobs, there are also those that also have high AI exposure and have these like low complexity that could mean that there's sort of replacement of whole, if not the whole job, at least parts of jobs.
Could you give a little bit more color about some of the sectors and jobs that have high AI exposure? I know you talked about white collar jobs that are highly paid, but there are things that machines are doing now that I don't think anyone ever thought would be capable versus human beings, right? So they're doing surgeries, they're doctors. This is some of the most sophisticated stuff that, our human brains are so complex, and this is our best achievement, right? Being like a brain surgeon is like the peak of human brain capacity, and still it's under threat from machines. So what are some of the jobs and sectors specifically that you consider high exposure to AI versus the low exposure?
The healthcare sector is such a piece of the regulation around it. There has been tremendous development in terms of the tools and machinery available to surgeons that can help with parts of the jobs. Typically, when I think of highly exposed AI occupations, they do tend to be sort of more technology as well as finance oriented. So we're seeing some of the highest exposed roles, like I said, in software engineering, database administration. Like, it just turned out that ChatGPT is incredible at debugging code and writing code. It's also very low risk in that sense to use AI that way. So I think those are really the ones that we're seeing to be very exposed. Also financial analysts, and the less exposed roles are the ones that have really high shares of social and human tasks. So everything that is in leisure and hospitality, restaurants, sales also has fairly low exposure. While there's a very highly automatable part of sales, the actual like most of the sales part remains sort of a human task. Anything that's strategy and community outreach related also tends to be low exposure. So sort of a mix of manual tasks as well as social tasks. Also, of course, that's constantly changing in terms of like what we consider AI to be able to do and expose. So admittedly, my AI exposure score at this point is a year and a half old, and I probably need to revisit my thinking as to what AI can do and can't do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some of the songs or videos that AI can produce, art forms that I thought really were reflecting the human spirit at its most, it turns out can be pretty easily replaced by machines. So I guess it's an evolving idea of what humans versus machines can do. Now,
Yeah, listen, I've been in this research since like 2019, and when I first like started thinking about like the tasks most exposed to AI, it used to really be very like pattern recognition, like let's stop training radiologists, right? Like that was sort of the going thought of like, yeah, what does ML like inherently do? And then ChatGPT came out and it's like, okay, it's all the writers. The writers are like, going out the window. But then it turned out that actually ChatGPT was really good at coding. And so I think it's a very like ragged frontier that we're constantly discovering what the technology can do.
Because this technological shock of AI is going to interact with people's existing skills and experience differently. Another way of saying that is that some people's skills could be much more replaced by AI, whereas other people's skills could be augmented by AI. I believe the Economist term is skill bias technological change.
Yeah.
It sounds like that will increase inequality because you have this new technology that is going to increase productivity and thus demand for certain people's labor, and otherwise lower the demand for certain people's labor. So do you see a threat here to, or a risk to inequality from AI?
I think we're already seeing AI to sort of drive a wedge further into the wage distribution in the economy. I'm mostly positive in the sense that there are just tremendous opportunity to basically for workers to make themselves more productive if they decide to sort of pick up the tools and use them. I mean, this is a very overused phrase, but the person using AI within your job is going to displace you, not AI, right? Like someone else doing the job at twice the capacity. You don't want to be in competition with that person. And that's this complexity idea that I brought up earlier. There are just going to be jobs at the lower end of the wage distribution with lower complexity and just higher shares of chunks of work that can be and potentially is going to be displaced. But of course, at the same time, AI is also creating a ton of new jobs as well. It's just always the question of redistribution, right? Like it's not going to be the same people getting some of these new jobs. It's always an ongoing process of change, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind is that the economy is always dynamic and the labor market's dynamic, and it's what allows, the U.S. economy specifically to be quite flexible in growing and becoming more productive is the ability to change. But there is a transition process that can be tough for certain workers. The term economists give for people who are out of work because their skills don't match the needs of the economy is called structural unemployment. And for the people who are maybe displaced by AI, how long do you think this structural unemployment usually lasts? I mean, to take one example, even if we haven't totally replaced entry-level computer programmers, many of those jobs that we might have seen 10 years ago, let's say that now it's being replaced by an increase in the demand for healthcare services, taking care of elder care. Now, it takes some time for people to shift their skills, and how long does that usually take? And sometimes do they not even make the shift? I mean, if we look at certain distressed regions in the US where manufacturing really struggled, it's easy to say in a textbook form, oh, well, those people in the Rust Belt, they should have just learned how to code. They should have learned to become pink collar workers, all of that.
I think you need to meet people where they are, and nobody assembling cars or driving trucks is going to learn how to code. Not that, there aren't success stories, but I think it's not a scalable solution. And in that similar vein, I don't think the software engineers not currently not finding jobs in tech, should or will retrain as healthcare professionals. And that seems like, another big investment in education and skills, but they rather will sort of trickle into other more closely adjacent roles in the economy, whether that's a more senior software engineering role, a more consulting style roles. Just when we think about occupational distance matrices more closely aligned. And that's what we're seeing as well. At the end of the day, youth unemployment has ticked up, but it's also not crazy high, right? Or youth unemployment in the sense of like, under 30-year-olds. So people are still finding jobs, even if it's not in that one dream job at Google that they previously had in mind.
Looking now at the very long term, using the Industrial Revolution as a historical example, there was a period where the efficiency gains from all these new machines did not flow down to the average person. They didn't make a measurable improvement in the quality of life for the typical worker. Eventually, of course, they did, but it took time, arguably decades, Do you think the same thing could happen with AI? Let's say any productivity gains go to tech companies and a really narrow group of workers without making consumer goods and services cheap enough to offset any labor market displacement that some people could face.
Yeah, I think there is sort of a concern, especially when we are looking at, right, um, the stock market and the outsized returns we've been seeing, and yet that obviously like doesn't directly impact people's earnings or wages, or like you say, make goods and services cheaper. Contrary to the times of the Industrial Revolution, we have policies in place that are more redistributionary and make sure that there is a little bit more shared prosperity. Obviously not a whole lot in this country. I'm from Europe, so I always look sideways there, and maybe obviously the redistribution being a little overdone over on the old continent, but still, even in comparison, I think there are faster ways in which the productivity gains are being shared now.
People sometimes say that technology during the Industrial Revolution replaced brawn or human strength, and now technology is replacing brains, human intelligence. So I want to end with a very existential, high level question, which is there a possible future where demand for human labor is just lower and there's a narrower set of economic tasks that humans need to do rather than machines?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a possibility. I think we're very far from that. I think if that is true, then we really need to think about how to reorganize society and redistribution. In that case, it used to be unimaginable to not be working 6 days a week, and now people work 5 days a week, and even talking about 4 days a week. So it's the truth is probably, if anything, a more gradual shift. And if that leads to us all having a little bit more time for other things, it doesn't have to be such a gloomy future, but I think the policy environment that allows to, meaningfully design that is one that has to be carefully thought through and discussed.
Lisa Simon, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks. It was a pleasure, Will.
That was Lisa Simon, Chief Economist at Revelio Labs. Her breakdown of where AI is impacting workers in their current roles provides all of us with some perspective into where AI could have the most impact in the economy and in our own jobs. Reduction of manual tasks, albeit with human oversight, appears primed to boost productivity while not eliminating jobs. Despite the government shutdown being over for more than 2 months, the BEA and other government agencies are still digging out of the backup in data collection and releases. The November Durable Goods Report is set to be released on Monday, where orders are expected to bounce back after a poor showing in October. November S&P housing inflation data is set to follow on Tuesday, along with the January Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index. The consensus estimate is for a 1-point rise in sentiment to a still bleak 90.1. The January FOMC meeting is next Wednesday, and markets do not expect another rate cut at the meeting, although some doves on the committee could dissent in favor of a cut, including Vice Chair for Supervision Mickey Bowman and Governor Stephen Miron, who has dissented in favor of a jumbo-sized 50 basis point cut since he was placed on the board in September. More importantly, this Fed meeting could provide some forward guidance for the Fed's inflation outlook, given the lower than expected CPI inflation prints over the past few months. Next week rounds out with the December PPI on Friday, which is expected to rise 0.2 headline and core. The BLS is still catching up on data releases, but should be back to normal in time for January. February kicks off with the January ISM Manufacturing Index on Groundhog's Day, along with November housing starts. The December JOLTS report follows on Tuesday, along with January car sales. Markets will finally see a normal employment week, with ADP employment and the ISM Services Index for January on Wednesday, jobless claims on Thursday, and of course the January employment report on Friday. Of those, the January employment report is most important, especially the unemployment rate in January. The trend in the unemployment rate has been higher since May of 2025, but it ticked lower in December to 4.4%. The Fed and markets will be eager to see if that was a blip in the trend, or the recovery of employment with 175 basis points of rate cuts in the rearview mirror. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Mark Streiber, economic analyst with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments.
This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.